The Department of Justice has released millions of files tied to Jeffrey Epstein, and it's reignited a firestorm of speculation on the internet. People are digging through documents, searching for familiar names, and building narratives that often say more about their prior beliefs than the evidence at hand. And in a case this disturbing, it's easy for rumor and speculation to overtake fact. But here's the reality. Even without the theories, the documented, verifiable evidence alone paints a story that is hard to explain. So in the first part, we're not chasing internet claims. We're walking step by step through the verified timeline, the rise of Jeffrey Epstein. And in part 2, we'll examine the network around him and try to answer some of the unanswered questions that remain even after his death. Our story begins in New York City, 1974. On the Upper East Side of Manhattan, at the elite private school, the Dalton School. The headmaster, Donald Barr, had just made an unusual hire, a 21-year-old math and physics teacher named Jeffrey Epstein. It's a strange decision. Epstein is a college dropout with no degree, no certification to teach, and no clear qualifications for the role. And Donald Barr is a name worth remembering, because by the end of this story, his connection will feel a lot less ordinary. Barr was born in Manhattan to a Jewish family and during World War II served in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the wartime intelligence agency that later became the CIA. After the war, he continued working in intelligence through the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research before eventually moving into academia and educational leadership. One more strange detail. In 1973, the year before hiring Epstein, Donald Barr publishes a science fiction book he wrote called Space Relations, a story set on a distant planet ruled by oligarchs who have entangled themselves in a system of child sex slavery. Yes, really. Epstein would only stay at the Dalton School for about 2 years, but at his time there, he would meet a connection that would change his life forever. He met Alan Greenberg, a senior executive at Bear Stearns and soon to be CEO. Greenberg hired Epstein. He started at the firm at a low level, but within a few years, he had risen through the ranks to become a limited partner, something absolutely unheard of by the age of 27. But in 1981, Epstein suddenly left Bear Stearns, which was reportedly tied to a regulation issue due to a Reg D violation. Even so, he remained close to Greenberg moving forward. Using his network and credibility from Wall Street, Epstein starts his own financial consulting firm in the 1980s, marketing himself as a man who specializes in managing wealth for the ultra-wealthy. This is where the story starts to get murky. During this period, Epstein was reported to possess a fraudulent Austrian passport, listing a false residence and identity. This is also important to remember for part 2. He also moved in circles that included Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi businessman often described as the global middleman in high-level arms deals, transferring American weapons from Israel to Iran during the Iran-Contra affair. Around the same time, Epstein became involved with Stephen Hoffenberg, the then Jewish-American CEO of Towers Financial, who hired him as a consultant in 1987. Years later, Hoffenberg would plead guilty to defrauding investors of $475 million in what would become one of the largest Ponzi schemes in US history. Hoffenberg would later claim that Epstein played a central role in the operation. Allegations echoed in a 2018 lawsuit filed by investors who claimed that the stolen money could have resulted in the seed money for Epstein's future financial empire. But it was through this relationship with Hoffenberg that Epstein would form a new relationship, one that would change the trajectory of his future going forward. His connection to Robert Maxwell and his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, reports on how Jeffrey Epstein first entered the Maxwell orbit are conflicting. One version claims that Epstein met Ghislaine in 1991 when she moved to New York shortly after the sudden passing of her father. This suggests that Epstein may have never even known Robert Maxwell, but another account tells a much more interesting story. According to Epstein's associate, Stephen Hoffenberg, along with claims from former Israeli intelligence-linked individuals, Hoffenberg himself introduced Epstein to Robert Maxwell in the late 1980s, possibly through a mutual connection, British associate Douglas Leese. In this version of the story, Robert actually introduces Epstein to his daughter himself. Now, there's no definitive paper trail proving that this ever happened, but Epstein's pattern of attaching himself to powerful, financially complicated figures, and Maxwell's increasingly unstable financial empire by the late 1980s would certainly give the two reason to know each other. And to understand why that matters, you need to understand Robert Maxwell, because his life sounds much less like a business novel and more like a Cold War espionage novel. Born in Czechoslovakia to a Jewish family, he fled during the Nazi occupation, joined the Czech forces in exile, and went on to serve as a decorated member of the British Army during World War II. After the war, he built a massive publishing empire, acquiring newspapers and media companies across Europe, and becoming one of the most powerful media moguls of his time. But alongside the public success were long-running allegations of his connections to Israeli intelligence. Now, Israel has never publicly confirmed ties. Maxwell has often been credited by former US prosecutor John Loftus for playing a crucial role in the Czechoslovak decision to arm Israel in the 1948 Arab-Israel War, including allegedly smuggling aircraft parts into Israel that would help them gain air superiority over the war. And later accusations go even further. According to former intelligence figures and investigators, Maxwell allegedly helped distribute compromised versions of the promised software to governments, intelligence branches, and financial institutions around the world. Software said to contain hidden surveillance capabilities that can enable large-scale spying. Among the institutions reportedly receiving this bugged version of the software were some US facilities, including Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratories. Around the same time, former Israeli intelligence-linked individuals would also accuse Maxwell of involvement in the operation that brought the Israeli nuclear whistleblower out of Europe and back into the hands of Israel, where he would later be tried and convicted of treason and imprisoned. Now, none of these claims have ever been fully proven in court, but they paint a picture of a man operating in circles far beyond publishing and media. And whatever Maxwell's true connections were, his financial state at the early 1990s is far less mysterious. In 1991, Robert Maxwell was found dead in the Atlantic Ocean near his yacht, in what was officially ruled as an accidental drowning. But his death immediately triggered investigations that revealed something staggering. Maxwell had secretly siphoned roughly £450 million from his own company's pension funds to prop up his dying empire and to pay off personal debts. And his business empire unraveled almost overnight, which raises an interesting possibility. Maxwell's finances were already spiraling by the late 1980s. He would have needed a financial fixer. Not just any fixer though. Someone comfortable in operating in the gray areas of international finance. Someone skilled at moving money quietly. Someone willing to bend the rules or ignore them entirely. Someone like Jeffrey Epstein. And whether Epstein met Robert directly or only entered through Ghislaine later, what's clear is what happens next. After her father's sudden death, Ghislaine Maxwell moves to New York in 1991, where she would meet and form a close personal and professional relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. From that point on, she became central to his world, helping to expand his social connections, expanding his elite network, and as later established in court, playing a key role in recruiting and grooming underage girls for sexual exploitation. And in 2022, she was convicted on federal sex trafficking charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And so by the mid-1990s, Epstein's wealth, access, and influence were growing rapidly. And before long, those same connections would help him survive the first moment that should have ended his rise. Because soon, Jeffrey Epstein would be caught. And instead of bringing him down, his network would help him make the problems disappear. At least for now. Now that brings us to November 2004. Palm Beach police receive a tip that young girls are seen coming and going from Jeffrey Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. And just weeks later, Jeffrey Epstein donates $90,000 to the Palm Beach Police Department. What he was trying to accomplish with that, I'll leave up to you to decide. But at first, no formal investigation begins, so whatever he was trying to do there seemed to work, at least for a little while. But 4 months later, in March of 2005, everything changes. A woman contacts Palm Beach police with a disturbing claim. Her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been brought to Jeffrey Epstein's home by an older girl, where she was paid $300 to strip and give Jeffrey Epstein a massage. And this time, the police actually move. Over the next 13 months, investigators uncover a pattern far larger than a single incident. Detectives identify numerous underage victims and describe witnessing girls, some appearing extremely young, arriving at Epstein's residence straight from school with backpacks and braces. And by the end of the investigation, Palm Beach police believe they have a case strong enough that could put Jeffrey Epstein in prison for the rest of his life. So in 2006, they file a probable cause affidavit recommending serious felony charges, including unlawful sexual acts with a minor and sexual abuse. And so it looks like the end of the rise of Jeffrey Epstein. But then, quietly, things begin to shift. 2 months later, Epstein is arrested, but the charges aren't what investigators expected them to be. Instead of multiple counts involving minors, Epstein is charged with solicitation of a prostitute and procuring a minor for prostitution. So, what happened? Palm Beach State Attorney Barry Kreischer declines to pursue the stronger charges. Prosecutors argue that the girls, some as young as 14 by the way, could be viewed as prostitutes. And so the case goes before a grand jury, which returns only a single solicitation charge. For the victims, it looks like justice is slipping away, but there still is another path. The FBI has been running its own investigation. And in 2007, federal prosecutor Maria Villafana drafts a sweeping 60-count indictment. The case moves up the chain of command, ultimately landing under Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. What happens next has become one of the most controversial prosecutorial decisions in U.S. history. Federal prosecutors under Acosta's leadership began negotiating directly with Epstein's high-powered defense team, including attorney Alan Dershowitz, himself later accused by some Epstein accusers of misconduct related to Epstein's network, allegations he has denied. The negotiations happen largely out of the public view, and the deal they reach is extraordinary. Epstein agrees to plead guilty to 2 state charges, including solicitation involving a minor. In exchange, all federal criminal charges are dropped, the federal investigation is halted, the indictment is sealed, and immunity is extended not only to Epstein, but also his, quote, unnamed co-conspirators and any, quote, potential co-conspirators. The scope of that immunity would later shock investigators, journalists, and victims alike. And so Epstein is sentenced to 18 months in prison. Except it wasn't actually a prison, but a private wing of the Palm Beach County Stockade. There, he's granted work release privileges, allowed to leave custody up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And in the end, Epstein serves 13 months of his 18-month sentence. But if you actually calculate the hours he potentially spent outside the facility, it amounts to roughly only 7 to 8 months of actual custody time. And afterwards, Epstein walks free, and life for him continues. Years later, Alexander Acosta would go on to become U.S. Secretary of Labor under President Donald Trump's first term. Now, during his vetting for that role, Acosta was reportedly asked if the Epstein case was going to become a political problem for his appointment. And according to later accounts, Acosta allegedly responds that he had been told to back off, that Epstein belonged to intelligence and was above his pay grade. All quotes. And so was this simply a catastrophic failure of the justice system? Or was something happening behind the scenes? Something far above the prosecutors, investigators, or even the FBI? What is certain though, is that it was this deal that allowed Jeffrey Epstein to walk free. And because of that, his operation would continue for years to come. By the mid-1990s, Jeffrey Epstein had built not just wealth, but access. A web of connections that allowed him to move within elite circles with impunity. His early brushes with the law and the controversial 2007 plea deal didn't stop him. If anything, they highlighted the system's blind spots and the ways that influence and power can shield individuals from accountability. Epstein's rise, people who enabled him, and the structure that let him operate, these are only the first few pieces of a much larger puzzle. In the next installment, we'll explore the network that he moved within, billionaires, politicians, and power brokers that intersected with his life, and the questions that remain about the reach and resilience of his influence. The rise of Jeffrey Epstein is just the beginning. The network around him, that is where the story truly deepens.